This distinction between the native mythology and the universal mythology of the Old Testament actually translates into another related but different form of thinking that has to do with rhetoric and persuasion. Because and I will be covering ancient Irish rhetoric and contrasting it with Greco-Roman rhetoric. And the relevance of this distinction is in part going to be very helpful when we come to consider St. Patrick, because what happened in with the Greco-Roman tradition, and just to make a quick understanding of the difference, if some of you went to university, you might remember debating colleges where smart and ambitious boys and girls turn up to the historical society or the philosophical society or the legal society, and they are set up to argue with each other. And so it's very much about encouraging a form of discourse and debate that's very close, very centrally rooted in the Western intellectual tradition, going right back to Aristotle and right back to the polis in ancient Greece. It is about arguing, and it is about logic and producing better arguments than the other person and winning the debate. The ancient Irish approach to persuasion is completely different. It is very much about storytelling, about myth-telling, and about world-making. And this is going to prove very relevant when we come to consider why Patrick was successful. So what we know is that Europe was very heavily influenced by Roman culture. Julius Caesar began the invasions in the 1st century BC, and then there were subsequent conquests, and essentially Roman influence spread. And if any of you are interested in, look at the Mythic History of Ireland video that Bill and I and Dahi O'Hogan worked on. Essentially, Roman culture spread throughout Europe. Now, one of the things they did was suppress the indigenous native traditions of those cultures. Now, it was relatively easy to do because they had the Roman army behind them. And if you have a choice between your family surviving, if you will sign up to the new religion, most people will make that choice because off with your head is not a very attractive option. The Romans never got to Ireland. However, what happened is that even after the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, as Europe moved into the Dark Ages, this Greco-Roman rhetoric still flourished because St. Augustine had repurposed it for the Roman Catholic Church. And his book on Christian doctrine dealt with a Pelagian controversy, which he won by argument. It got formally instituted. So essentially, the Roman Church was hugely influential in the continuing of this Greco-Roman form of argument stroke rhetoric. And the exception to this form of persuasion was Ireland. Yes, Ireland had been converted, but no soldiers came. So many of the Celtic religious rituals, civic practices, and educational institutions carried on in the old Bardic form. And let's now divert, and by the way, their Christianity that emerged in the time of the Dark Ages in Europe, as many of the Roman, the post-Roman era was a Dark Ages in Europe. But in Ireland, it was a very different period where a different form of Christianity emerged, and the monasteries, universities, libraries became a stable place for learning, and they held up much of the intellectual tradition of Europe. Now let's have a look now, a little diversion into what the Bardic schools were, because I think what we'll find is that they are evidence of a very different style of education and teaching, and indeed rhetoric. What we do know from the Rees brothers in their wonderful book, Celtic Heritage, is that the bards were a very privileged order. The apprenticeship was long and arduous. Zimmerman tells us it was up to 12 years. We picked that up from a source called Uraid McCoyce. And what the apprentice learnt was hundreds of tales. Some say 250 primary and 100 secondary. So right at the core of this education tradition is a deep emergence in the cultural myths and the cultural stories and the cultural legends. You learnt them by heart. And one of the effects of being deeply steeped in a mythographics, I believe, is it actually gives you what Manannán MacLear gave to Bran, silver branch perception. It gives you a way of seeing deeply because you understand these stories that are in a way a language of the emotions, of the deep cultural roots, the currents of culture, and the deep cultural feelings can be understood once you have a deep sense of a culture's mythology. And I think this is why Vico was talking about Fantasia. He says you've got to be steeped in these cultures, mythologies, because then you are rooted in the world of the deep emotions of culture. So what we also learn is that these stories were told very often, essentially at every important occasion: seasonal festivities, assemblies, wedding nights, warming a new house, feast, eve of battle, bringing out ale, and before setting out on a voyage, courts of law. So the first one is seasonal festivities. Imbolc, Bealtaine, Lunasa, and Samhain would have been occasions at which these stories were told. So a picture begins to emerge of a style of education that was very, very different from the Greco-Roman rhetoric. It was about storytelling. And what the bard would do is, when they had an important occasion, such as the ones I have just outlined, is they would select from their database of stories, to use a modern term, a story that suited the occasion. And we all know what, and by the way, Ireland was an oral culture there. They didn't have writing, and one of the effects of writing is it fixes a tradition. So the bards were hugely respected, hugely revered, and had a huge apprenticeship, and were absolutely pivotal in many aspects of life. We also learned that the Fianna, you had to learn 12 books of poetry, and Fiona a few weeks ago told us about the 30-year training in the bardic and healing arts of Bridget. And we also know that the three great gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann were also accomplished poets and harpers, Dagda, Lu, and Ogma. And Ogma was described as drawing a willing crowd of people fastened to him by a slender golden chains, the ends of which pass through his tongue, which sort of is a very colorful and flowery way of describing the arts of a great storyteller. So let us now move on to St. Patrick, who, as we know, is credited with bringing Christianity to Ireland. And what we learn about St. Patrick is he was brought up in a world in which the Greco-Roman form of rhetoric was very central. And his father was a local magistrate and a church deacon. His grandfather was a priest. He would have been very much a pupil in the Greco-Roman tradition, which was basically essential for every young man to have any hope of a career in government, military, or the church. But what happened to Patrick was at the age of 15, he was kidnapped by a raiding party. The English weren't the only people to invade. The Irish went across and picked up Patrick. And from the age of 15, he was living on a hillside tending sheep, at which he learned Irish legends and myths, and he completely missed out on the classic rhetorical training. He did escape age 21 and went back and became a committed Christian. And he got a message, so the story goes, that he had to go back and convert the Irish. But think of what his educational initiation was. It was in the arts of ancient Irish rhetoric and storytelling. And one of the things that would have happened when he came back is his whole approach would have been storytelling. And there's one very important and powerful element of this form of persuasion, which is so different from argument, and the term is identification. And what that is about is that the storyteller tells a story in such a way that the listener feels as if the storyteller has a deep understanding of where they are emotionally. If they feel shame or hurt or anger, the story that the teller would tell would leave the listener feeling, this guy understands me. And I have to say that if we look at American politics, in the 2016 election, we had an example of one of the candidates who was very skilled in the art of what was ancient Irish rhetoric. And when he stood up to speak, many of the audience who were feeling disillusioned or feeling disenfranchised and were feeling angry, they had the feeling that this man on the podium gets me. So he totally, brilliantly understood identification. Whereas the highly educated Harvard and Yale were putting together policies and putting together arguments, which their rational mind said are absolutely guaranteed because there's the logic is so perfect. And so even in modernity, we have a re-emergence in a secondary oral culture world of examples of the use of identification and storytelling and taking people on an emotional journey. And Aristotle said that the four aspects of rhetoric are logos, ethos, pathos. Logos is logic, ethos is ethics, pathos is the emotion, and there's another one, kairos, which is the ability to connect with tradition. The Greco-Roman approach begins with logic, then perhaps goes on to ethics or ethos, then it makes a kind of cursory go at pathos, and then kairos comes in last. The ancient Irish began with pathos. You have to understand the emotional space that the people to whom you're speaking are in at the moment. And I think that was the genius of the 45th president of the United States. So let's go back to Patrick. Why was he so successful? He was the first missionary. When he arrived in Ireland, it was dangerous because he had some quite radical ideas. But what is very clear is what saved him was his education in the ancient Irish form of rhetoric. He would have understood where the Irish were, and he would have begun with that, and he would have foundationally been a storyteller. So in a while, what we're going to hear from Chowbang is the encounter in Acalavna Senarak between Patrick and Oisin, Finn McCool's sons. And I think it's a very interesting encounter. But I just wanted to pull out there this very important difference between ancient Irish rhetoric, and I'll be sending you out this sheet and a write-up because it highlights the rhetorical difference between the ancient Irish and the Greco-Roman that's so pervaded. And it does make Ireland very different in many ways, because in Ireland, this connection with the story tradition has carried on ever since. So what we have then is two mythologies, the native and the universal, but we have two forms of rhetoric, the ancient Irish, and I'll send out an article on it, and the Greco-Roman. Okay, so let's have a chat about that. It's very much part of the story of the stories in small groups until 8 o'clock, and then it'll be back to hear from Chow Bang on a story.